If it would be great if it was good for America, but it's not. I mean, dividing people up by race, denying opportunities based on race, telling oil companies to invest in windmills, which we know are inefficient. All that stuff is not good.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It's a great pleasure to welcome Charlie Gasparino, my colleague for many years, decades even. He is at Fox News. He is often in the news because of breaking stories on Wall Street. These are exciting moments. We're at the edge of the new AI world. At the same time, we're dealing with what Charlie's writing about in his new book, Go Woke, Go Broke, the inside story of the radicalization of corporate America, which comes down to a series of acronyms we will attend, but the big one is ESG. The book takes us to a search for the origins, and I congratulate Charlie because it hadn't occurred to me that I had to find the place where it all started. Today, ESG is understood as, the French word is passé. However, it's still with us politically, if not on the street. Charlie, congratulations. This is a joy to read.
Thank you.
It's much reporting over the years, and it's a way of telling the madness of these last 4 years since the pandemic struck. But it's still with us in some fashion. So we begin with the search for origins. And we're talking about ESG, DEI, and the understanding that America is not acceptable in its present form. Where do you believe it started in corporate America, on the publicly traded companies that are sensitive to the population? Good evening to you, Charlie.
Thanks for having me, John. Yeah, and corporate America's sort of willing embrace of that notion and becoming a foot soldier in the movement to take the country to a progressive destination. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that corporate America tried to go there in immense ways. It's now failing at it because corporations do have to answer to somebody called the American people and their money, and people are voting with their pocketbooks against this. And we can go through the various examples, but what I tried to answer a couple of things. First off, I tried to make this a funny book to show how stupid and counterproductive and horrifying corporate wokeness is when it manifests itself. But, where did it begin? How did we get to a place where asset managers, like big investment companies, which are very powerful, like BlackRock and Vanguard, people save, use your investment money to try to get their portfolio companies, the companies they invest in, to enact progressive change, to use ESG, environmental social governance sort of notions of running their business, where they have to cut back the carbon footprint. Even if you're an oil company, stop drilling for oil, have DEI, essentially racial quotas in management, and give money to Black Lives Matter, which essentially checks a couple boxes on the ESG scale. Where did they go? Where did that come from? How did that become such a big thing before the backlash, which the last quarter of the book is about the backlash? How did DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? I mean, we started out with affirmative action where, if you're a poor Black guy, we're going to try to get you, or a woman, we're going to try to give you a chance. We're going to try to do outreach. We're going to try to make the world more diverse. There's lots of evidence on how this worked over the years. How do we go from there, from this sort of regimented, quasi-Stalinist system, which says you have to do this. You can't hire any more white people in this job. A coal miner's daughter is put to the back of the line for some dude from South America because that hits more DEI metrics of intersectionality, which is another term about the notion that, you're graded on the basis of how many of these oppressed classes you represent as a person. If you're a gay white male, you're behind a gay white female. You're probably behind a Black female. I mean, this is just how it goes. And, how did corporate America embrace this stuff that, was sort of like a backbenchers sort of theory back in college? And, it's slow, but it did happen. It becomes, like most utopian notions, it has utopian aspirations to make the world a better place. I covered it in when I was at the Wall Street Journal in 1995, something known as socially responsible investing. Again, it was very backwater, but it started to sort of pick up. You would see it, the UN pick up on this sort of social responsibility investing, and then start talking about this thing called ESG, which started to come out of the UN. And then it started getting big in places like Davos, where people were actually talking about it. You also had an evolution of who was in the boardroom. I mean, gone were the old tough guys like Jack Welch, and a new, more progressive era of CEOs came in there that were inculcated with, more progressive notions at big schools. I mean, I go through them. Jeff Immelt, who took over for Jack Welch at GE, Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, Larry Fink at BlackRock, which was a huge purveyor of ESG. So you have a sort of political shift in the boardroom, and then you have certain flashpoints which push corporate wokeness in all the manifestations I mentioned: DEI, ESG, you name it. And one flashpoint was clearly the 2008 financial crisis, which a huge wave of populism. There was conservative populism in the Tea Party, but they were more focused on the Fed and printing of money and debasing the currency. But then you had a sort of liberal progressive populism that best sort of demonstrated by what went down in Zuccotti Park in New York City with Occupy Wall Street, and that had real resonance with the political class in Washington, and an emerging class of progressive lawmakers like Barack Obama, Elizabeth Warren, who were going to use the tools of government to enforce, progressive change in the boardroom. They were threatening it. Obama threatened to nationalize the banks. Elizabeth Warren wanted to, get rid of, if she had her druthers, she'd probably put every CEO in jail after the financial crisis. Hearings ensued. And you really saw this sort of thing where, it was almost a cover your backside notion, where companies started to politically parrot the left right around that point as a form of protection, I think. Now, what was fascinating about it is that there were a few smart companies, like GE went big in solar and windmills, which didn't do much for the bottom line. GE, as you know, is a shell of itself now. It's selling itself off. It's not the GE of Jack Welch. It blew up when it went this way under his successor, Jeff Immelt. But some places figured out how to make money, and that's where BlackRock comes in and figured out that, hey, this ESG thing, we can make a lot of money doing this. We can virtue signal as we invest people's money by attracting trillions of dollars of money from public pension funds, from Europe, which has gone very woke in its European sovereign wealth funds, and we can and even individual investors that want to save the planet as they invest. And given their size, $10 trillion, they became this sort of hammer in the woke corporate ecosystems. They could literally tell Exxon what to do: go more into windmills, less into oil exploration, and they made a lot of money doing it. And I spent a lot of time talking with Larry Fink, the CEO, who had the he had the guts to come and explain his side of the story. What was interesting about Larry, I think, and I think he kind of, in many ways, tells the story of how we got from, corporate America making money to worry about the shareholder capitalism, to what's known as stakeholder capitalism, where you try to make the world a better place through these various means of ESG, DEI. His whole thing, it's not pure evil. I mean, people tried to frame him as being pure evil. It's not. It's a mixture of incentives. Yes, he is politically progressive. Yes, he wanted to make a lot of money. Yes, he did want to make the world a better place, and he loved the adulation that came with it. And then something happened, and that's the last part of the book, where it sort of unravels for him and all the other places that went woke. And it's still unraveling. There's still corporate wokeness. There's still a huge debate. We have a presidential candidate in Kamala Harris who says you got to be woke. Is more woke the better. We'll see if that flies in a presidential race. It clearly hasn't done very well with national brands. I mean, it's one thing to have a niche product. It's another thing to sell to the nation, and wokeness doesn't sell nationwide.
Let's do some definitions, Charlie, because we're using a lot of acronyms, but we have to fill in the blanks. And Larry Fink's a good place to start with those acronyms. I'm
Right.
speaking to Charles Gasparino. His new book is Go Woke, Go Broke: The Inside Story of the Radicalization of Corporate America. It's the story of, as Charlie says, Zuccotti Park was 2011. It's the story of the last decade plus, because it crashes from one crisis, the Great Recession, to the pandemic of the 2020s. And all of the craters that were created all these years are still smoking. And one of them is corporate America's lack of confidence of its future, and also the investors' lack of confidence in some of the CEOs who went woke. And Zuccotti Park, Charlie and I both were there at different moments, seeing what essentially was an encampment, not dissimilar to some of the encampments that have been in the news recently, but it was centered around, well, it was sentimental. Reminded me of my youth and the anti-Vietnam protests of the 1960s and 70s. There were Marxist books laid out. There were no NLF flags, but in any event, it would have been if it was 1969 and not 2011. And the people who were there tended to be hirsute and not corporate, but they were objecting to something that was not true, but it was in the news, that the banks were paying out big bonuses despite the fact that many people had lost their houses because they'd bought something that they couldn't afford. That was the Great Recession. Here we are, though, talking now about some acronyms, and I need some definitions, Charlie. You mentioned Larry Fink, and I find him a compelling person, chiefly because he talked to you. So many of these CEOs did not, and that's not helpful. That doesn't tell us what happened. All right, you've mentioned ESG and DEI, those two things. There's also HR. And I became suspicious after a while, Charlie, that the HR invented all this stuff. Is that true? Did they embrace it first and then it went up the corporate ladder?
Great question. I don't think so. I think it was embraced at the top, and I think it got infused into the corporate ecosystem at places like Davos, and the UN began with it, with ESG, environmental, social governance, investing, DEI, and in these sort of it's interesting. CEOs are very, very, very much into groupthink. I mean, all these guys, they all go to Davos. I mean, I've been to Davos. I mean, it literally is groupthink, progressive groupthink on steroids. And they take notes, and they do what this guy does, and their clients breathe the same air as they do, and it becomes a sort of it becomes this whole sort of you're all eating off the same plate, so you're all catching the same virus, so to speak, if someone is sick. And and I think that's kind of like where this thing started to populate. It started to populate in classrooms like Jeff Sonnenfeld's at Yale. It runs a very big thing. I hear him in the book. It's the Yale CEO Summit. Some of the same precepts are expounded at that. And it becomes an ecosystem and a feedback, this sort of feedback loop where it just keeps going around and around.
You're suggesting something, Charlie. It's in your book, but I didn't see it till you just made that remark. Was
right.
DEI and everything that follows, was that a reaction to Zuccotti Park? Were they frightened by Elizabeth Warren going on Comedy Central and giving interviews saying we've got to redo the law here? There was even talk of confiscation in the House of Representatives. I remember that. Is that what are we talking about? Men who made a decision to go on defense?
I mean, that was clearly one of the flashpoints. Another flashpoint was George Floyd. We can get into that later. Yeah. But clearly one of the flashpoints was the 2008 financial crisis and the progressive populist backlash that came after that. There's no doubt about that, because that's when you saw all these companies start talking about stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder capitalism, where ESG became sort of a bigger thing at BlackRock than it was before that.
And what is that, Charlie? Is that excusing the stock price? Is that why they do that? It fools me even now. Why are they so stakeholders? Your job is to make me money, not to worry.
I know, but the way they probably look at it is like Elizabeth Warren might cost you more money if we get on the wrong side of her. She might confiscate, she might impose a 90% corporort tax and try to push that through, Congress. Remember when
more
in
acronyms.
2008, the Republicans lost both the House and the Senate, and they had a community organizer as the president. I mean, it was kind of a left lean. It was a turn to the far left at that point. Now there was a backlash within 2 years. Remember, the Republicans took Congress, took the House, but make no mistake about it, there were some crazy times there.
Another acronym, SEC. What's it stand for, and what part does it play in it?
Well, it's not the Southeastern Conference. It's in this book, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission, which traditionally had become an investor protection agency, which in recent years, particularly under Joe Biden, more so than even under Obama, and obviously not so much under President Trump, the Securities and Exchange Commission became like an enforcer of woke corporate policies. I mean, right now, Gary Gensler is looking to enforce woke environmental policy on companies, forcing them to disclose their carbon footprint. He's also mused about disclosures of DEI and how where like diversity in the ranks, particularly in management and in board membership, and it's I address that in the book. So so we've gone from protecting shareholders at this big agency to enforcing wokeness, progressive policies, and that is a scary thing. Now, it could all reverse if Trump gets in there, but it's now being sort of solidified inside that agency.
All right, it's time to tell some stories, and they're a whale of stories. Charles Gasparino is the author, Go Woke, Go Broke, the inside story of the radicalization of corporate America. We set up the superstructure, but let's bring on stage a favorite of every child in the 20th century, to my experience, from the Second World War on. But we can look at examples, because everything's in the example. We're going to go to the Walt Disney Company, a place in Florida where I took my children happily in the 1990s. It was a joy. The last time we went there was the beginning of the 21st century. They're all grown up now, and we have wonderful memories and pictures everywhere. And then, Charlie, this is a crime to take Walt Disney and turn it into a political act. Was it Bob Iger who started this, and then Bob Chapek inherited it, and then Bob Iger took it back? I can't figure out where it began at Disney, because clearly it wasn't there when I was there in the 90s. There was a Jungle Cruise in the 1990s. They shot at rhinoceroses. There were people in the jungle.
Yeah.
They're all gone.
Yeah, I mean, so the Disney that you experienced, which was this sort of brainchild of Michael Eisner, who wasn't quite he's not like a raging conservative, by the way, John. I mean, he's Democrat, but he was a business guy, and his whole theory of Disney was a sort of entertainment conglomerate that was along the lines of GE, and he kind of ran it that way. He was kind of a Jack Welchian type guy, tough guy, very Machiavellian. But he created the modern Disney, which had ESPN as a subsidiary or a sports subsidiary, parks, movies. I mean, some of the biggest movies they've ever came during the Eisner years. He had some management blind spots. I mean, you just have to go through the some of the stuff that went down with Michael Ovitz coming in and leaving, and he ran afoul of the Disney family, which still had a board seat at the time, and he eventually, after a very successful run, gets essentially pushed out, and then the guy that replaces him is Bob Iger, who's this sort of very sharp, operator who's also very woke. And he brings he's able to paper over a lot of his wokeness, because media, when he took over, and so we're talking, 2000 or so, check the date on him.
Beginning of the century.
Yeah, beginning of the century. So 2000 or so, he takes over. Media is on a roll. All these big media companies are making tons of money. They're killing it. And, so he can go left, which was part of which he had a cultural affinity to, along with some of the cultural factors affecting, broadly the left-wing populism we just talked about from Elizabeth Warren and everything. He can go left in programming, in what's going on at the theme parks and everything else, without it mattering that much, because Disney was making tons of money. So he basically retires in 2019, announces retirement. Disney stock is doing pretty well. But the company is so far to the left at this point, it's not funny. Like Congress people are starting to talk about it. The cultural right is starting to say, what the hell is going on at this theme park? And then, he turns the company over to his handpicked successor, a guy named Bob Chapek, who, by the way, is a Midwestern kind of Republican type guy, not a big cultural warrior. He's not really plugged in Hollywood. He was an operations guy inside Disney. So he comes with a kind of interesting resume and a few sort of managerial blind spots. But he, and then, it's funny. So Chapek gets in there. At the same time, you have the ascendancy of the cultural right that basically takes over Florida. Florida no longer is a swing state by 2019, 2021, 2020. It is the home of Ron DeSantis, one of the conservative movement's rising stars. Its legislature is staunchly conservative. Florida has become a place where conservatives that live in New York flee to, where the Hispanic population is very conservative because they've fled, communist dictatorships across the world. The Puerto Rican, there's a diaspora of Puerto Ricans in Florida right now, but they're the middle class that got sick of living in Puerto Rico and they moved to Florida, and they're much more attuned to conservative policies. They're much more family oriented. You put all this together, and Florida is like, it's very essentially is middle America in Florida right now. So Chapek comes over, and he knows that now. Remember, Disney has its home base in Burbank,
right?
But its real home is Florida, where it's got its expansive parks. And he wants to make nice with this guy, and so, but he does run a blue company in a red state. So the first thing that DeSantis does, because he's prepared to run for president, is he passes a law that taps into the sort of cultural leanings of the emerging conservative movement, and says, you know what, no more same sex, no more sex ed for toddlers. We're not going to teach kids pronouns. We're not going to teach them how to have gay sex. We're not going to teach them about the trans movement. We're not going to teach them. We're going to, like, parents, if you want to do it. But until you get into the third grade, it's not happening here. Very popular law in Florida, not popular with the Disney rank and file. And what happens is Chapek initially stays out of the fray, says, listen, I want nothing to do with this. Iger on the sideline, when the law comes out, it gets dubbed the "Don't Say Gay" law, right? Becomes a political weapon by the cultural left. And Iger comes out and says it's outrageous that Disney is not taking a stand on this. And it just lights the fuse against Chapek inside his company.
And Chapek, did he see that Chapek, did he take this on to prove that he was worthy of Iger's attention? Why?
No. Point, and if you read the book, John, at that point, he's at odds with Iger. By the way, Disney's finances are going south at this point.
Yeah.
Out because all the stuff that Iger rode the wave of, a lot of good luck with the markets, but then he did something kind of crazy and he bought for like $60 billion. My boss's, Rupert Murdoch's, my ultimate boss's entertainment assets out of Fox, laden him with a lot of debt. And, and then, they had to get into streaming, which is costly and not profitable. COVID shut down the parks. I mean, Chapek had a mess on his hands financially that he had to deal with. So he didn't want to deal with this other stuff. And then the revolt inside his company occurs, and he freaks out, and he does support the law. And what happens is DeSantis calls him in and says, listen, this is crazy. You're supporting this. Disney does business in China, which is the most oppressive place in the world. Florida's not oppressive. All I'm saying is, we don't teach kids sex ed until they're out of third grade. And he goes, "Oh, I have to oppose it. I'm getting heat from internally." He goes, "Okay." And so he goes to war with DeSantis. He does he overcorrects on wokeness, and he loses badly, and he's out in a few months. And Disney has really never recovered from that.
And Iger comes back in,
and then he's actually forced to go less woke. He had ends with DeSantis. On, remember, DeSantis was going to threatened to pull, and did pull
right.
Special taxing authorities called Reedy Creek.
That's gone. They got rid of it,
and they're not fighting it anymore.
Right.
And and Disney
started this, and then he comes back and looks like the hero.
I don't think he looks like the hero. I think what happened was, when he came back, he wasn't treated like a hero. He got activist investors in the stock. He was forced to make changes and, cut people. And now they're talking about selling ESPN. And it's he's got a mess on his hands, in terms of a media company, and he can't afford to go woke now.
Let's mention ESPN quickly, because you also tell the story, which I did not know, that ESPN went political at some point.
Oh, yeah.
And is now it's not at this point able to right itself because of cord cutting, because of a change of habits of the younger generation.
ESPN still makes money, but if you look at on a lot of money, but the trajectory is it's going to make less because of cord cutting. And one of the problems they have is that they become so political that there's if you want to be virtue signaled while you listen about sports stuff, that's fine, but a lot of people don't, so they lost a lot of their audience. I tell the ESPN saga through the saga of Sage Steele, who's a mixed race woman who was one of their top stars, very talented broadcaster, who had the temerity to be kind of conservative. I wouldn't say she's totally conservative, but she was skeptical of the vaxxers. She said it at the time. She's a mix. She's got a white mother and a black father who she loves dearly. Both of them. I interviewed her.
Who played football for West Point?
Oh yeah, the guy's a military guy. I mean, he's a tough guy, and he's like, he instilled certain values in her, like never give up, and speak your mind. And she would speak her mind, and her mind was heterodox. What was in her mind was heterodox compared to the woke ideology of ESPN. She spoke out against trans men in playing in women's sports, the men that transitioned to be women in women's sports. She, the racial justice riots, the largely peaceful riots that were essentially burning down cities. She was against, she spoke about that. She gave an interview on a podcast where she explained the difference between her and Barack Obama, where she couldn't understand. I mean, she raised this issue, and it's interesting, and this cost her career. She said three things. She said it was evil that Disney, which owns ESPN, forced her to take the vax. She said evil. And, a gun to her head is kind of evil, but she said it. She said that then she made a comment about her parents, and she said, I love my parents, both of them. I'm mixed race. Barack Obama wants to be black. He can be black. He can do him, and I can do me. But I don't understand how he was raised by a white mother, not his black father. So she raised the issue with him. Whatever it did, it caused the show, excuse the language, inside ESPN. And, over the next year, she negotiated her exit package, so to speak.
You mentioned what happened to her, and that's an aspect of this that we need to attend, Charlie, which is that woke capitalism was and maybe still is intolerant, and it won't
It is.
suffer a dissent. And so when we come back, what has happened to woke capitalism at the investor level? And Charlie has a list of banks that have taken a step back. The book is Go Woke, Go Broke, The Inside Story of the Radicalization of Corporate America. Charles Gasparino is the author. But we come to a point where woke capitalism is still out there. It's still being practiced at the human resources level. Questions are still being asked of employees, all of that. But there seems to be no longer a surge of it. There's backpedaling. And Charlie goes through some of the backpedalers. Why? Because they lost money. BlackRock down with $14 billion of withdrawals. You mentioned IS shares of global energy down 27% when everything else is doing well. And Larry Fink recognizing that ESG wasn't the best idea for him to gain success forever. And so he's backed off and become something of a moderate. But this is the list that got me, Charlie. Goldman is discontinuing or at least cutting back on diversity programs. Ken Griffin goes to Florida. David Solomon of Goldman is thinking about Texas. Am I over-interpreting these things? It looks like they're abandoning ESG.
They are. And they're abandoning woke, progressive politics wherever it is. Goldman also has a big office in Salt Lake City now, in that area. Decidedly unwoke area. No, I mean, there is a backlash. They're feeling it. I mean, listen, companies were, as woke as these guys want to be. And by the way, they were after George Floyd. It was like, I could just listen to them. I quote all these people. It was as if they knew who George Floyd was, and they thought America was. They saw the America through the lens of the critical race theory. They respond to the bottom line, and the bottom line was that you go there, people are not going to do business with you. People are going to take their money and put it elsewhere, and you're going to be pilloried by the conservative media. And some of what happened to Larry Fink, to be honest with you, was the brainchild of some guy named Will Hild, who ran something called Consumers Research, who made him the sort of the poster child for wokeness. His face, and it got picked up first by red state pols, and then and then the media actually went, started explaining it. It started covering it as well. And I don't think any of these guys want to go there anymore. Plus, they listen. You don't want to. I mean, they realized finally that if you go woke, you're going to annoy half the country, but probably much more than that. More like 60-70% of the country. I mean, let's face it. The most woke people are the activists you hear about on Twitter, and not average people. They don't like that stuff. They don't want to, when they take their kids shopping, they don't want to see endless rows of pride displays, rainbow colored onesies and tuck friendly bathing suits. It just rubs them the wrong. It doesn't bother me, just so you know, but it rubs people with their kids the wrong way.
There are protagonists in Charlie's story. I want to mention especially Ed Rensi, former CEO of McDonald's, the man responsible for the Ronald McDonald House many years ago, as an understanding of how to give back something to the community that supports him. But the one that is so towering over everybody is Bernie Marcus. And you end with your conversation with Bernie Marcus. What does he think of? He's 94 years old. He says with a 60-year-old brain. Good for Bernie.
Yeah.
One of the founders of Home Depot, a man who understands you must make money for your stockholders. What does he think of the fate of woke capitalism is? We have a couple of minutes, Charlie.
He would say the fight's not over. He thinks most of these CEOs today are cowards. They'll go with the wind. The wind is blowing against them now. And, people like me, journalists who aren't afraid to write about heterodox topics and stories, need to fight back. Need to keep doing our job and exposing this stuff, because the stuff is really bad. I mean, listen, it would be great if it was good for America, but it's not. I mean, dividing people up by race, denying opportunities based on race, telling oil companies to invest in windmills, which we know are inefficient. All that stuff is not good, and, companies become political arms, not good. You know what I'm saying? Stay out of the politics, employ people. One of the great, I have an anecdote in there about Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank was this big bank that, went belly up, because it didn't manage its balance sheet, but it was just obsessed with woke stuff. It should have been managing its balance sheet. And I could go on and on. So this is not good for America, and it's not good for business, and it's not good to try to proselytize people, your customers, and if you go there, people are going to fight back. The mainstream media is less powerful today than social media. And that's what happened with all these brands. These sort of rebellion began on social media. Right. And there are reporters like me who are going to fight back.
And that is how you can read Go Woke, Go Broke. This is the story of the beginning of the pushback against what has become an intolerant and unacceptable conduct by men and women who have the power of the purse over their employees and abuse them in some instances, not all. The book is a chronicle of some of that story. Go Woke, Go Broke, the inside story of the radicalization of corporate America. Charles Gasparino of Fox Business is the author. I'm John Batchelor.